Given every day and night in this war of mine has a time limit, it is very important that you can get around your house and the scavenging locations quickly. Welcome back to a survivor's guide to this war of mine. Today we will be looking at Pavle, who is the fastest character available in the game. His trait is Fast Runner, which is pretty self-explanatory. He is the fastest character and is pretty average in everything else, making him a good jack of all trades. He is a useful addition to any team in the game. His combat rating is D, and his guarding rating is C, and so he is useful on both of those fronts, and he's also able to play the guitar. Pretty much everything you'd want in a man. As for his personality, he is homey and cares about the people in his shelter. If they are suffering, he is likely to get depressed. His morale is also likely to be affected if he commits crime or attacks anyone. Therefore, it is worth using him for less questionable activities if you don't want to risk him getting broken. This can shift though if he is traumatized enough, moving to insensitive, which means he focuses on his fellow survivors rather than external people, and then you can get away with a few more questionable activities. So that is his mechanics done, so we will now look at the story of Pavle. Before the war, he was a professional football player, which explains his speed. The way he tells his story leading up to the war depends on whether or not he is traumatized in your game. We'll start with his happy story, then go into his sad story, then move on to his endings. Pavle's happy story. All this shelling, sniper fire, and lack of supplies makes you want to hide away, sit down and cry. But we cannot let them crush our spirit. We have to show them that they can't take away our dignity. It's difficult here, but you know how we did it on our street? Number 2. It was tough, but women living on our street took great care to look beautiful. They were always clean and wore their best clothes. That was a sight, I tell you. Lining up for water, they looked as if they were waiting to visit the theatre. And my boy came up with another idea. Number 3. You can't just lock kids inside with nothing to do. Life will find a way. So my boy formed a football team. They trained in a dark basement. They were so committed and came up with an idea to organise a Poggeron Cup. We invited 3 other teams, but there was a significant problem we had to overcome. Number 4. The sports hall survived the shelling, but to get there we needed to cross the bridge under Grozny's sniper fire. The peacekeepers refused to help us with their armoured transport, so we waited for a foggy night and just made a wild run for it. We made it safe. There weren't many spectators, but it was still the most memorable football cup of my life. My boy was so happy. The next day, my wife managed to escape with him abroad. I'll see them again when this is over. However, if Pavle ends up traumatized, he will tell a slightly different state of affairs. Number 1. All this shelling, sniper fire, and lack of supplies makes you want to hide away, sit down and cry. It's hopeless. When the buildings on my street were still standing, we were trying to preserve our dignity. But did we manage to? Number 2. Women from our street took great care to look beautiful. They were always clean, wearing their best clothes, despite the terrible conditions. We tried so hard, but it was all in vain. Only kids still had some hope left. Do you know what my boy did? Number 3. You just can't lock kids inside with nothing to do, so my boy formed a football team. It was heartbreaking to watch them train in a dark basement. They came up with an idea to organise a Poggeron Cup. Even though I was terrified, we invited 3 other teams. We had a very serious problem to overcome. Number 4. The sports hall survived the shelling, but to get there we needed to cross the bridge under Grozny's sniper fire. The peacekeepers refused to help us with their armoured transports, so one night we made a wild run for it. We didn't make it. They were just kids. How can anyone shoot at kids? The next day, my wife took him abroad. She was furious. I don't think I'll ever see them again. In some ways, Pavle's story is more uplifting than a lot of the others, which makes a nice change, even though when he's traumatized, it does have a negative spin to it. His endings to the war, however, are decided on your actions in the game. If Pavle dies during the war. Sadly, Pavle died. Will his family come back to Poggeron to visit his grave one day? Or would it be too painful, a reminder of what they had gone through? Do the dead even care? If it is too much for Pavle, and he kills himself. The only thing that kept Pavle going was the hope of seeing his son again. Having lost that hope, Pavle did not want to carry on and committed suicide. If Pavle decides to leave one night, Pavle decided to leave the shelter one fateful night. The next morning, he was shot in the back, running from the bandits. If you reject Pavle when he comes to the door, Pavle was not welcome in the shelter. He was forced to fend for himself. Now we get on to the final endings. If you get through the entire war with Pavle, but his ending is not great due to being traumatized and bad karma upon him. Pavle survived the war. He tried to find his wife and son, but despite his best efforts, he could not trace them. He decided to stay in Pogoran, hoping his son would come and find him there one day. That day never came. If Pavle makes it through the war but is depressed by what has happened to him, Pavle survived the war. He tried to find his wife and son, but despite his best efforts, he could not trace them. He decided to stay in Pogoran, hoping his son would find him there one day. Years have passed, and he is still waiting. And finally, the best ending. If Pavle makes it through the war without committing atrocities, getting traumatized, or being depressed, you get the following ending. Pavle survived the war. After months of searching, despite numerous difficulties, he manages to find his wife and son, who had sought refuge in France. He went there to live with them, and they never came back to Pogoran. So there we have Pavle's story. I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, please do like, subscribe, and consider donating to War Child, the lovely charity who made this game. Thanks very much, and I'm hoping to see you in the next video. Ta-ra.